Ever notice how some people struggle when they discover their partner has been dishonest? Well, I didn't. I just poured another glass of wine and watched the whole thing unfold like I already knew the ending. Some men find out their wife is cheating and completely fall apart. They cry, they beg, they call their friends in the middle of the night slurring their words and asking how this could happen to them. But that was never going to be me. Welcome back to Dad's True Revenge. So grab something to snack on, settle in, and keep in mind every person in this story had a chance to do the right thing. They just didn't take it. And if you're listening, stick around because this one gets interesting fast. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and the night my wife tried to hand my life over to another man like it was nothing more than leftover takeout, I didn't argue, I didn't shout, I just smiled, poured myself more wine, and said 2 quiet words in perfect German that made a very powerful man freeze. But before we get there, I need to take you back a bit, because if you don't know where I came from, none of what happened later is going to make any sense. And trust me, none of it was an accident. It all began on a Tuesday, which if you ask me is about the most insulting day possible to have your life start falling apart. Not a dramatic Friday, not even a slow, gloomy Sunday, just a regular, forgettable Tuesday. That day had already worn me down more than usual with back-to-back client calls and a cup of coffee sitting on my desk, so long it had gone cold and lifeless like it had given up right along with me. When I finally looked up, Olivia was standing by the kitchen counter leaning just right, wearing that specific smile she always used when she wanted something from me. Olivia had that kind of beauty that pulls you in the same way a storm does. You stand there, admiring it, thinking it's incredible. Right up until the moment everything collapses around you, Ethan, she said in that warm, honey-soaked voice Victor wants to. Take us out to dinner on Friday. He says he wants to meet the man behind the woman. Victor. Her boss. Victor Halberg, a senior managing director at Brenner Weiss Capital. The type of guy whose suits probably cost more than most people's cars. I had been hearing his name for 2 years now. Always casually, always in passing. Usually when Olivia came home late from meetings with a certain glow on her face and a habit of not quite looking me in the eye when she mentioned him. I glanced up from my laptop and told her sure, that sounds great, and I smiled like it was nothing. Olivia blinked like she didn't quite know what to do with that reaction. I could tell she had expected some pushback, maybe a suspicious look, maybe even a little jealousy, but I gave her none of that. Just a calm smile before going back to my screen. What she didn't know, and what she had no way of knowing, was that I had been waiting for that exact dinner for a very long time. Now, to really understand me, you need to know where I came from. Because none of this started in some fancy office. It started in a small town out in rural Ohio. It was the kind of place where everyone knows your name, but nobody knows your story. Where the library is the most interesting place within miles, and not much ever changes. My mother, Margaret Caldwell, raised me on her own, without ever offering excuses or explanations. She just did what needed to be done. She worked nights at a nursing home, then picked up shifts during the day at a diner, and somehow still had enough energy left to sit with me at night and drill vocabulary words into my head before bed. She never once spoke about my father, not when I was a kid, not when I was older, not ever until the night she was dying. I was 31, sitting beside her hospital bed, holding her hand so gently I was almost afraid it might break. The machines around her kept making that steady, indifferent beeping sound while she turned her head and looked at me with a kind of sharp awareness that didn't match how weak she looked. Ethan, she whispered, there are things I should have told you. I tried to brush it off, telling her she didn't need to say anything, but even then she had that ability to shut me down instantly with just a quiet hush. Your father's name is Leonard Halberg. I froze completely. The name hit me harder than I expected. She explained that he had been a visiting lecturer at her university back when they were young, and that he had been charming, convincing the kind of man who gets what he wants. She paused for a moment, closing her eyes before continuing, and told me that when she found out she was pregnant, he handed her money and a one-way bus ticket back to Ohio. He made it clear that if she ever tried to contact him again, he would make sure she regretted it. Then she looked at me again and told me he had another son, a legitimate one named Victor, who was now running the family business. She added that Leonard was old and sick and had recently started changing his will. The machines kept their steady rhythm while she spoke slowly, telling me she wasn't sharing this so I would go looking for trouble, but so that if trouble ever found me, I would understand exactly what I had in my hands. She passed away 4 days later, and after that I did what I have always been good at. I started digging. For 6 months straight, I focused on research because professionally, I work as a forensic financial analyst, which basically means companies hire me to find money that other people are trying to hide. Following trails, connecting details, uncovering what's buried, that's what I do, and Leonard Halberg had left behind plenty of threads to follow. The short version is this. Leonard was dying from stage 4, prostate cancer, and his legitimate son Victor was set to inherit control of Brenner Weiss Capital, which was worth somewhere around $600 million. But somewhere along the way, whether it was guilt or something darker, Leonard had started making moves to change his estate to include a second heir, a son. He had never acknowledged. He even hired a private investigator to track down my mother, only to find out she had died just weeks earlier. But her son, me, was still very much alive. That meant I was about to become a serious problem in Victor Halberg's life. The only thing I didn't know yet was whether Victor already knew about me. Then, about 4 months into all of this, Olivia came home one evening and casually mentioned that she had a new boss. His name was Victor. I sat with that information for a long time, longer than most people would, letting it settle and connect until I asked myself if it could possibly be a coincidence. It wasn't, not even close. So I did the most reasonable thing I could think of. I kept my mouth shut, I smiled, and I waited. Friday finally showed up like it had plans of its own. The restaurant Victor chose was the kind of place where prices don't exist on the menu not by mistake, but because if you have to ask, you probably shouldn't be there in the first place. The whole place was dark wood and soft candlelight with a sommelier moving around so quietly it felt like he was gliding across a floor. No one else could see. Victor was already sitting when we walked in, and he stood the moment he saw Olivia. And the way he did it, that slight lean forward, that quick flash of warmth before he covered it up told me everything I needed to know about them. He was tall, with silver hair and a sharp jawline like he had been built for authority. The kind of guy who probably had a more impressive profile than most people's resumes. He reached out his hand to me with a wide, confident smile and said, "Ethan, I have heard so much about you." His German accent was faint, almost polished away like he had spent years trying to soften it. I told him I hoped it was all good things, he said. Of course, but his eyes were saying something else entirely, something like, "You have no idea what's going on." I shook his hand firmly and gave him a smile of my own while making sure my face revealed absolutely nothing. We sat down, ordered food, and let the conversation roll, on the way it always does when two people are putting on a show for someone else. There was plenty of laughter, plenty of charm, and just enough distance from anything real to keep it comfortable. Olivia looked radiant that night, glowing in a way that didn't have anything to do with me. She reached over and touched Victor's arm twice while laughing. She didn't touch me once. You ever sit at a table and realize you're the only one who actually knows what's going on? Well, that was me that night, and I just kept eating, like everything was normal. I kept it simple. I ate my sea bass, like I didn't have a care in the world. I asked Victor a few polite questions about the markets. Like I was just another curious guy, I made sure everyone's glass stayed full like a good host would. And then, right there between the main course and dessert, Olivia rested her hand on her stomach. It was subtle, almost unconscious, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. But I had been watching her closely for months, and I didn't miss anything. Victor saw it too. His eyes dropped to her hand, and she gave him the smallest nod like they were sharing something quiet and secret. Then Olivia turned to me and gave me that warm, practiced look, the one she had clearly rehearsed, and she said something to Victor in German. She told him not to worry, that I was so happy about the pregnancy that I believed the child was mine, and that I would raise his son without ever knowing the truth. She even laughed a little after saying it, like the whole thing was just harmless fun. Victor let out a breath and his shoulders relaxed just a bit, like a man who had been holding tension and finally let it go. And me, I just sat there smiling, slowly swirling my wine like a man who didn't understand a single word being said around him. I let that silence sit there for a few seconds, just long enough to feel it settle. Then I placed my glass down, leaned forward a little, and spoke in the calmest, most precise German I had ever used in my life. I told him his father said hello. The change in his face was instant, like someone had drained the color right out of him. Olivia's hand stopped moving completely, like her body forgot what it was doing. And somewhere else in the city, an old man named Leonard Halberg was lying in a hospital bed waiting for a call from a son he had only just found, while everything about his legacy was starting to shift. I picked up my wine again like nothing had happened and switched back to English, asking if we should go ahead and order dessert. Now, here's the thing. There's a kind of silence that actually feels heavy. Not peaceful, not comfortable, but heavy. Like it's pressing down on everything around it. It's the kind where nobody knows how to react, so they just sit there, trying to figure out what their face is supposed to look like. That's exactly what filled the space around our table for about 11 seconds, and yeah, I counted every single one of them. Victor Halberg, the powerful, polished man worth hundreds of millions, was staring at me like I had just broken the rules of reality, like a chair had stood up and introduced itself. His mouth hung open just slightly, and I got the feeling that a man like him hadn't been truly surprised in a very long time. Watching him try to process what just happened was honestly one of the more satisfying moments I've had in years. Olivia, on the other hand, looked completely different. She stared at me like everything she thought she understood had just disappeared under her feet. Her hand was still stuck on the table, and her face cycled through emotion after emotion, so fast it was almost impressive. First shock, then confusion, then anger, then fear, then calculation, and finally that sharp panic. You only see when someone realizes they made a mistake so big there's no fixing it. I took another slow sip of my wine. "Ethan," she started to say. I cut in gently, talking about the wine, like nothing else mattered, mentioning how exceptional it tasted, and casually asking Victor whether he preferred Bordeaux or Burgundy, like we were still just having a normal dinner. "Ethan," her voice came back sharper this time, asking what exactly I had just said. I looked at her with pure confusion, like I had no idea what she was talking about, and repeated my question about dessert, telling her maybe she hadn't heard me because it was a little loud. That's when Victor finally cleared his throat. And I want to stop for a second, because you need to understand something about that man. Victor wasn't stupid, not even close. He was arrogant, sure, entitled without a doubt, and he had spent most of his life benefiting from a name and money he didn't earn, which made him think he was smarter than he really was, but he was still sharp, and I could see it in real time. In those few seconds, he had already started adjusting already, trying to figure out what kind of situation he had just stepped into. He lifted his glass, took a slow, controlled sip, set it down carefully, and when he looked back at me, the warmth was gone. What replaced it was colder, more focused. He said that I spoke German, not as a question, but as a statement, like he was buying himself time. I told him I had been speaking it since I was about 19, and that my mother always thought it would be useful, which turned out to be true. Olivia let out this strange sound that almost passed for a laugh, the kind that slips out when you're barely holding yourself together. She tried to speak again, but I said her name quietly, not angry, just enough to make it clear she should think very carefully before saying anything else. She stopped right there. Then I turned back to Victor and casually mentioned his father, Leonard Halberg, like I was commenting on the weather. I told him exactly where he was staying in the hospital and reminded him how long ago the diagnosis had been, and how serious it was. I pointed out that situations like that tend to make inheritance a very urgent matter, especially for someone in his position. Victor didn't move at all. He just listened. I continued explaining how his father had started updating his estate months ago, even mentioning the law firm handling it. And when the paperwork had been filed, I added that I figured he had probably learned about it around the same time, and that it just happened to line up with when he started showing a strong interest in my wife. The candle between us flickered a little, and Olivia made this quiet, choking sound like she couldn't quite breathe right. I leaned back in my chair, completely at ease, like a man finally putting down a weight he had been carrying for far too long. I told him I wasn't exactly sure what his plan had been, whether he was using Olivia to gather information, whether he thought getting close to me would give him leverage, or if he had something else entirely in mind. I admitted I had my theories. Then I tilted my head just slightly and let him know I had spent about 6 months looking into him, his finances, his legal records, his business structure. And just for good measure, I mentioned the 3 offshore accounts that I was pretty sure his own board would find very interesting. Funny thing about truth, when it finally shows up, it doesn't knock politely. It just walks in, sits down, and waits for you to deal with it. Victor slowly set his wine glass down, and I could see the shift in him, like he was adjusting to a completely different game. I told him calmly that I wasn't there to threaten anyone, and I meant every word, because that wasn't the point of the night. I explained that this wasn't some dramatic confrontation. It was just an introduction, the real kind, without pretending, without all the little performances we had been putting on. I gestured lightly between the 3 of us and said that now that everything was out in the open, maybe we could finally talk honestly. What happened after that is something I've replayed in my head more times than I can count. Olivia broke down. Not the quiet, composed kind you see in movies, but the real kind, messy, sudden, and completely out of control. Like something inside her had finally cracked wide open. She covered her mouth with her hand and her shoulders started shaking. And for just a second I felt something I had spent 6 months trying very hard not to feel. Because the truth about Olivia is simple, and not something I'm proud of. I had loved her for real. Not in some dramatic, over-the-top way, but in that slow, everyday kind of way that sneaks up on you while you're just living your life, the kind where you're sharing bad pizza late at night, laughing at things that aren't even funny, or sitting in the car, because the song on the radio is too good to interrupt. That kind of love, the kind that makes you feel a little foolish when you look back on it. Somewhere along the way, things between us had changed, and instead of talking about it, instead of being honest, she made a decision, and that decision was sitting right across from me at a table that cost more per plate than my first car. I looked at her for a while, then I looked away. I asked her quietly about the baby, still keeping my eyes off her. I asked if it was actually his. There was a pause. She tried to say my name. I cut through it and asked for a simple answer, yes or no. She wiped her face, and when she finally spoke, her voice was so small it barely made it across the table. She said she didn't know. I nodded slowly because I had already prepared myself for that possibility. What I hadn't fully prepared for was how it would feel, hearing it come from her voice. There was shame there, and confusion, and something genuinely lost. I took a drink of water and set the glass back down. "All right," I said. Victor had stayed completely silent through all of this, and that told me more about him than anything he could have said. A man who actually cared about Olivia beyond strategy would have reacted. He would have reached for her, or at least shown something human. But Victor just sat there still and calculating like he was running numbers in his head, adjusting his position in real time. That silence confirmed exactly who he was. Finally he spoke and asked me what I wanted. His voice was steady, almost impressive considering everything that had just happened. I told him that was a big question. He pointed out that I hadn't come there to make a scene, that I could have done that months ago if I wanted to. He said I had clearly been building towards something, and now he wanted to know what it was. I looked at him for a moment before answering. I told him I wanted to meet Leonard. Something crossed his face for just a second. The first real, unguarded reaction I had seen from him all night. It disappeared almost immediately, replaced by that controlled, polished expression again. But I saw it, and it wasn't anger. It was fear. He told me it wasn't possible. I told him simply that Leonard was my father. I reminded him that Leonard had hired investigators to find my mother, and had learned about me, which is exactly why the will was being changed. I pointed out that the real question wasn't whether Leonard knew I existed, but whether he would get the chance to act on it before everything was finalized. Victor didn't respond, but I could see the tension in his jaw, like he was holding something back with everything he had. I told him again that I wasn't trying to take anything from him, and I meant that too. I wasn't interested in his money or his company. All I wanted was to sit down with the dying man and hear the truth about where I came from. That was it, nothing more. So I told him the only thing that mattered that night was whether he was going to help me do that quietly, like two reasonable adults sharing an expensive bottle of wine, or whether he wanted things to get complicated. I glanced at Olivia for a second, then looked back at him. The candle between us flickered, and outside the city kept moving like nothing inside that restaurant mattered. No one said anything. And then Victor did something I didn't expect at all. He laughed. It wasn't warm and it wasn't bitter. It was short, quiet, almost like he respected what had just happened, like a man admitting to himself that he had just lost a move he didn't see coming. Then he mentioned my mother. Hearing her name hit me harder than anything else that night. He said his father used to talk about her sometimes, especially after drinking. His voice had changed when he said it, like this had nothing to do with business anymore. He told me Leonard had said she was the smartest woman he had ever known, and that letting her go was the biggest regret of his life. The table went quiet again. I said that Leonard probably didn't understand what kind of man that made him. Victor agreed quietly and said he didn't. We just looked at each other for a moment. Two men connected by the same father sitting in a world only one of us had been raised in. In the middle of a situation neither of us had created. Cleanly, Olivia had stopped crying by then, and she was just watching us like she was trying to understand something she didn't have the words for. Yet, I reached into my jacket, pulled out a business card, and placed it in front of Victor. I told him that was my number, and that I wanted to see Leonard before the month was over. Then I folded my napkin, pushed my chair back, and stood up. I told them the dinner had been excellent, and that the sea bass was especially good. And just like that, I walked out into the cold night, leaving them sitting there with two completely different ideas of how that evening was supposed to go. And the funny part, only one of us had been right all along. Turns out none of us really knew how that night was going to end. Not me, not her, and definitely not him. If you've been following along and want more stories like this, it actually helps a lot when you hit like and subscribe. Most people never do, but it keeps everything going. So I appreciate it more than, Here's something people don't talk about when it comes to revenge. Not the flashy version you see in movies. Not the explosions or courtroom speeches or walking away while something burns behind you. I'm talking about the real kind, the quiet kind, the kind that lives in spreadsheets, sealed envelopes, and months of staying silent when every part of you wants to speak. Nobody tells you that when it's finally done, when every piece falls exactly where you placed it. The feeling isn't victory, it's exhaustion, and something else too, something harder to name, but I'll get to that. Victor called me on a Wednesday morning. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and my laptop doing what I do most days, following the money. There's something almost calming about it. Even though people think my job is exciting, it really isn't. Most of the time it's just patience. You pull one thread, then you wait, then another, and eventually the whole picture starts to come together. My phone buzzed and I saw an unknown number with a German country code. I picked up on the second ring. He said my name, and his voice sounded different from the night at the restaurant. The act was gone, and what was left was just a tired man. The kind of tired you only hear when someone finally stops pretending. He told me he had spoken with his father's medical team that morning. Then he said Friday at 2 in the afternoon at the hospital, and that he would leave my name at the front desk. There was a longer pause after that. He told me his father wasn't doing well, and that I needed to understand that. Before walking into that room, I told him I already did. He said there were good days and bad days, and that Friday might be one of the better ones. I said his name quietly, the same way I had at dinner, and made it clear I wasn't going there to hurt anyone. There was silence for a moment. Then he said he knew, and I believed him. We ended the call, and I stayed at the table for a long time, not moving, not really thinking about anything specific, just sitting there with the weight of something I had been building toward for months. And honestly, it wasn't just months. It was a lifetime of a question I had never been allowed to ask. Eventually, I stood up, rinsed out my coffee cup, and went back to work, because life doesn't pause just because something important is coming. Now, I need to tell you about Olivia again, but not the version of her you saw at that dinner. I'm talking about the woman I actually fell in love with. We met at a work conference in Cincinnati, one of those events where everyone pretends they're there for professional growth, but really they're just waiting for the free drinks. She was standing off to the side in a red dress holding a glass of white wine, and she was the only person in the room who looked like she was genuinely enjoying herself. Not faking it. Not bored, just quietly amused, like she had stumbled into something better than she expected. I walked up to her and told her she looked like she was watching a nature documentary. She looked right at me and said she was trying to figure out which species was which. That caught me off guard, and I laughed. For real, we ended up talking for 3 hours straight. We skipped every single panel we had paid to attend. We shared a cab back to the hotel, and before she got out, she gave me her number and told me not to be weird about it. I told her I couldn't promise anything, and she smiled in a way I didn't fully understand at the time. We got married 19 months later. For 2 years, it was the most real thing I had in my life. And I want you to understand that, because this isn't a story about a man who was waiting for things to fall apart. This is about a man who loved his wife, and then, somewhere along the way, lost her. Not all at once, but slowly. It happened sometime in the 3rd year between her promotion, my long hours, and the quiet spaces that started replacing our conversations. It faded, the way daylight fades in late fall. You don't notice the exact moment it disappears, you just realize one day that it's gone. Friday came around like it had been building toward this moment all along. The hospital was one of those places that tries hard to feel warm instead of clinical, with soft lighting and art on the walls, and staff who actually look you in the eye. It doesn't completely work because a hospital is still a hospital, but I could tell they were trying. I gave my name at the front desk on the 4th floor, and a nurse walked me down a hallway that smelled like antiseptic mixed with flowers someone had probably brought in, hoping it would make things feel a little less heavy. She stopped outside room 412 and told me he had been awake since that morning, and that it was a good day in the careful way medical staff talk about things like that. I thanked her, and she left me standing there. I stayed at that door for about 15 seconds. It doesn't sound like much, but when you're standing outside the room where your father is dying, time stretches in a way you don't expect. Finally, I knocked once and stepped inside. Leonard Halberg wasn't what I expected. In my head, I had built him into something bigger, stronger, more imposing. The kind of figure that fills a space even when they're not there. That's what happens when you spend your whole life imagining someone who never showed up. But the man in that bed was just a man. 73 years old, thin from illness with white hair and hands, resting carefully on the blanket like they needed to be protected. There was an IV in his arm and a tablet next to him with a chess game open like he had been playing against himself. But his eyes were different. They were sharp, clear, and fully present in a way that made everything else about him feel temporary. He looked at me for a long moment and then said that I had my mother's jaw. I didn't move. He told me to sit down and called me son. That word hit me in a way I didn't expect. I didn't break down. I didn't make a scene that's not who I am. But something inside my chest shifted quietly, like a breath I had been holding. My entire life had finally been let go, honey. Funny thing is, the moment I had been waiting for my whole life didn't come with fireworks. It came with two men sitting in a quiet hospital room, finally telling the truth. I sat down across from him, and we talked for about 2 hours. I'm not going to repeat every word because some conversations belong to the place they happen in and nowhere else. But I can tell you what it felt like, what it meant. He told me about my mother. He told me about the university, and that spring, back in 1991, he described the day she stood up in a lecture hall and tore apart his entire argument on economics in front of a room full of students. He said she was so sharp and so effortlessly right that he fell in love with her before she even finished speaking. He told me about fear, too, about being young and privileged and too afraid to do the right thing because he couldn't imagine what it would cost him. He talked about hiring an investigator years later, and the day he found out my mother had already passed. He said that was one of the hardest mornings of his life. At one point, he looked down at his hands and admitted that he had spent his whole life with money and still managed to make a lot of bad decisions. I told him he didn't have to do any of this. He said he knew that. Then he looked at me and said he wanted to. He explained that at his age there's a difference between what you have to do and what you still get the chance to do, and that there weren't many chances left. I nodded because I understood exactly what he meant. Then he asked me what I knew about his son. Something in his voice made me slow down and choose my words carefully. I asked him what he wanted me to know. He studied me for a moment, then reached over and picked up a sealed envelope from beside him. He held on to it for a second before saying that Victor was a capable man, disciplined, smart, and good at running the company. Then he paused and added something that changed everything. He told me Victor was under investigation by the SEC for misleading investors about fund performance, and that it had been going on quietly for months. He looked at me and asked if I understood what he was saying. And yeah, I understood perfectly. Victor hadn't just been involved with Olivia because of the inheritance. He had been building a backup plan, a clean, reliable financial analyst tied to him through marriage, someone who could be useful if things started falling apart. I wasn't the target. I was the insurance. I told Leonard that Victor didn't know I was aware of any of this. He confirmed that he didn't. Then I asked about the will. He told me the changes were staying in place no matter what. He said I was his son, and that wasn't conditional. Then he finally handed me the envelope. He explained it was a letter laying out the truth about me and his intentions witnessed by his lawyers. He said it wasn't about money and that I could decide what to do with it. Asked him why he had told me about the investigation. He leaned back, looking tired in a way that felt deeper than just physical. He said it was because I was the only person left in his life who didn't have anything to gain by lying to him. That stayed with me. I left the hospital a little after 4. I sat in my car in the parking garage for a long time with that envelope sitting next to me while the city kept moving outside like nothing had changed. I thought about my mom testing me on words when I was a kid. I thought about Olivia the first night I met her, and I thought about Victor and that moment at dinner when something real slipped through his mask. Now I understood what that look had been. It wasn't just fear of losing money, it was fear of being seen. My phone had a few messages waiting, one from Victor asking how it went sent, not long after I walked into the hospital. One from Olivia asking if we could talk, and one from a number I didn't recognize which turned out to be a law firm that handled SEC whistleblower cases. I stared at that last one for a while. Then I started the car. What I did next matters. I called Olivia first. She picked up immediately, which told me she had been waiting for it. Before she could say anything, I asked if she was safe. That caught her off guard. She said yes, that she was home. She started trying to explain. I stopped her and told her something simple. That no matter what happened between us, that baby hadn't made any choices, and that I understood that. She went quiet for a long time. Then she apologized in a way that sounded completely real, like there was nothing left to hide behind. I told her I knew, and I meant it. We didn't fix anything in that moment. You don't repair something like that over the phone sitting alone in a parking garage, but we said what needed to be said. And when the call ended, there was something between us that hadn't been there before, something honest. I called Victor the next morning. I told him I had met his father. He said he already knew. Then he asked how I was doing and told me he wanted the real answer. I said I was fine, though that wasn't the whole truth. He admitted he wasn't. Then he said there were things he needed to tell me about his situation. I told him I already knew about the SEC. There was silence after that. Then I told him exactly what he needed to do. I said he should call his lawyers first thing Monday and start a full, voluntary disclosure. I explained that cooperating early changes everything and that he already knew that I told him to do it clean and do it fast before the situation got out of his control. Then I said something that surprised even me. I told him I wasn't his enemy. And the strange part, I meant it. The truth is, I didn't want revenge the way people imagine it. I just wanted everything to finally be finished. I told him straight that I wasn't interested in watching his life fall apart. I just wanted all of it to end clean. There was a long silence before he asked me why he wanted to know. Why I would help him after everything. I actually thought about it for a moment before answering. Then I told him the truth. I said he was the only brother I had. Leonard Halberg passed away on a Tuesday, and at this point I've come to accept that Tuesdays just seem to carry that kind of weight in my life. It was about 6 weeks after we first met, and in that time we had seen each other a few more times. We even played chess together twice, and he beat me both times without even pretending to feel bad about it, which I respected more than I expected. When everything was finalized, he left Victor in control of the company but with conditions tied to compliance, which, to his credit, Victor had already started handling. What he left me was something different. It wasn't just money. It was a letter. My name written into his life and a financial share he described in his dry way as something long overdue. But more than any of that, he gave me the truth. Something real, documented and permanent. And I learned. That's the only kind of inheritance that actually matters. Olivia and I didn't stay together. I'm saying that plainly because this story was never about saving a marriage. We tried for a while, and we were more honest with each other than we had been in years, which made things both better and harder at the same time. In April, she gave birth to a boy. The test confirmed what part of me already knew. He was mine. His name is Lucas. He has her eyes, my mother's jaw, and no idea yet how complicated his story really is. One day, I'll tell him everything, every piece of it, because I think my mother would have wanted that. Sometimes I still think back to that Tuesday in the kitchen. Olivia leaning against the counter, smiling that same way, telling me about dinner, like it was nothing. And me sitting there already knowing more than she could imagine saying. Sure, like it didn't matter, while knowing it mattered more than anything. People ask how I stayed so calm through all of it. The honest answer is simple. It wasn't because I didn't feel anything, and it wasn't because I didn't care. I stayed steady because of how I was raised. My mother spent her entire life showing me without ever saying it, that the strongest thing you can do when everything falls apart is refuse to let it change who you are. She carried her own truth without letting it turn her bitter. I carried it for a while too, and it didn't break me either. That means she won. And if she won, then I did too. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, raised by a woman who worked harder than anyone I've ever known, and loved me in a way that never once showed weakness. I found the father I never knew. I found a brother I didn't expect. I lost my marriage and found my son. And on a random Tuesday, the most forgettable day of the week, the woman I loved sat across from me and tried to give my life away, like it didn't belong to me. She had no idea I understood every word. She didn't know a lot of things, but the one thing she never realized. The one thing nobody at that table understood was that the man sitting there smiling quietly had already won.